Hello everybody, Brayden here and welcome to a new video. Today we're going to be doing something we've done before, and we're going to be looking at my first ever tournament game. If you check my main channel, you will see each video covers a full tournament. However, I thought I would also post each game individually on this channel, but I would cover it a little bit more in depth, and the main channel will be more for critical positions or critical ideas. So this is just a little bit extra if you're looking for something different or a new perspective on the games. So let's get into it. So e4, e5, knight f3, and knight c6. This is just a classic king pawn opening, as we can see. Nothing too crazy. d3 now, and bishop d6. And on my main channel, I did discuss that bishop d6 was the critical idea, and the reason why is because, well, it blocks in the d7 pawn, so the c8 bishop is unable to move. For example, if we play d6 instead, this bishop has avenues to develop. Of course, this bishop does become slightly restricted, but it would still be a much more favorable move. Bishop to d6 was played, bishop to e2, knight to f6, castles, and bishop to e3. And here I prefer white by a considerable margin. I think if they just play c3 and d4 upcoming, this bishop's going to feel very uncomfortable, and white should have a significant edge. I played b6, and I think the reason why is because I was deciding to move the bishop to c5, and I wanted it to be protected, of course. So I was actually kind of happy with this move. And, of course, my opponent played knight c3. I played bishop c5. They took. I took back. And now, honestly, I think I'm fine. Because I do have a lot of control of the center. I can play d6 to back up my central pawns. And who knows, maybe a knight d4 comes in the future afterwards. And maybe I have quite a bit of space, right? If you look at these two pawns, I have two pawns controlling the center, whereas they just have one. I don't really count the d3 pawn, even though it does control part of the center. It's just not a very active part of the center. It's more closer to like their side of the board. Still a good pawn though, of course. Anyways, knight a4, which feels a bit aimless because I can play d6, but knight a4 also I think was interesting because of the response with c3. Anyway, so I played bishop g4 in this position, and this was a great move, but I did not follow it up correctly. So in this position, they played d4, and I do have a tactic here, which I would like for you guys to look for. So the tactic is actually c takes d4, which was played, c takes d4, and now bishop takes f3. Why is this so important? Because the d4 pawn is just hanging, and they don't really have time for something like taking on e5, because I can take and attack their queen. And after something like queen takes e2, I can take with the knight or pawn. It doesn't really matter because I'm just up a piece, so you can kind of check out just a tiny bit. I would maybe just take with the knight, but not really important. But yeah, taking on f3, removing the defender of the d4 pawn, and this would be amazing. But instead, I took on d4 instead, and that's not quite right, unfortunately. They can take on d4 here, which I think is an interesting move. The whole point is if I take back, then they can take on g4, and of course if I take on e2, then they can take back with the knight. Of course, this pawn is hanging, but there is the move queen d5 in the position, which maybe I just lucked into during an analysis, maybe I didn't, but this would be annoying. So rook to c1 was played though, queen to e8, which is a very strange move because this just allows bishop to b5 potential, where now there's a bit of an ugliness going on here, right? I can play bishop d7, so I should be fine, but it's still something like, why would I put myself voluntarily in a pin like that? Instead, I think moving the knight would have been better, something like knight e5, or even just taking first, taking and then knight e5. I think something like this would be excellent, because if they take on d4, we can always capture, maybe play something like knight h5, knight f4 or something. Like it's equal material. There's still a lot going on. It's still anyone's game. Queen 8 feels a little odd to me though, and also wouldn't it be nicer if the rook could go there? But that's not what happened. So they played rook e1, and I think this is a good move. So this is actually something that I talk about a lot when I talk about alignment for students of mine, or anybody really. And here we can look at the rook and the queen, and we can see that there's potential alignment issues. So if pieces start getting removed, for example, this pawn and this bishop off the file, then they would be attacking my queen, and that could be dangerous. So that's always something to keep in mind. It's not necessarily a problem yet, but it could be. And after the move knight takes e4, it actually does become a problem because of, well, not bishop b5. This is what they played in the game. But there's actually a really funny move here. It's bishop d3 first. This attacks the knight and forces a response of some sort. So for example, after bishop to d3, which is a funny move because the whole point is you want to provoke d5 or f5. Of course, if bishop f5, there's knight h4 to attack the bishop. But for example, let's just say f5's played. Now bishop f5, or bishop b5, my apologies, is really good. And why? Because there's no bishop d7. That's kind of cute, right? But what if, for example, d5 is played to defend it? Now bishop b5 anyways, and if bishop to d7, there's this funny move knight c5. That's why bishop d3 is so strong. That's a really cool idea. So this is a bunch of like taking advantage of alignment tactics. Of course, none of this was saw in the game, as you can see from just like the overlay. My opponent and I were not really super duper strong. I was unrated, and I was playing for about a month. My opponent, I think, was like 970 or 940 if I recall correctly. So seeing stuff like this is craziness. But this is a really cool idea, and I wanted to show it. And it just didn't make sense to show in the main channel. So knight takes e4, bishop to b5. I play rook b8, and this just like starts hanging everything. So black is completely lost here. Bishop takes c6, queen e6, rook takes e4, queen takes a2 for some reason. Now they can just take on g4. They're just taking everything, but they take on d4 instead, which is fine because black is dead lost. It doesn't really matter at this point. But somehow, if you saw the main channel, you saw that I did come back. Queen b3, rook takes g4 finally, rook to b4. They should just trade queens, I think. Just trade, like when you're up material, the common idea is to trade pieces, but not pawns. Here, it doesn't even matter if pawns are traded too, because there's so much material. So just trade everything. And if, for example, we just imagine that these are off the board, right? All of the major pieces, because I only have major pieces and they have major pieces and 3 minor pieces. It's just 2 knights and a bishop versus a king, right? That's just completely losing. So that's why trading is good, because you prevent counterplay. But knight d4 was played. I traded, and I played g6, and they played knight e6 for some reason. Which doesn't make sense to me. It makes more sense to go somewhere like rook g3 or something along these lines, because you don't have to do anything. Even something like knight f5 makes more sense. And why? Because after rook takes g4, there's knight h6 check, which is a fork, and you just successfully trade another piece off, which would be interesting. But instead, knight e6 was played. And this allows me to take on g4, and although they do successfully exchange pieces, they're also giving up a little bit of material. It wouldn't matter, for example, if they could just like take this piece off the board and this piece off the board for my rook, then they're still just up a bishop. This is completely winning no matter what, but they're starting to slightly let me back in the game, as we can see. They weren't, now they're only up 2 minor pieces instead of 3. Shouldn't matter still, but we can see how this becomes a problem later in the game. So rook e1 was played. Now I played d5. The whole point is it's kind of like a trick. If bishop takes d5, rook takes a4. And they played rook e8 and knight c5. And now they're losing another minor piece. Still completely winning, but they're making their job more and more difficult each move. They played g3 because they have to worry about back rank mate. Rook takes c5 now, and bishop a4. And as we can see, again, although it's a completely winning position, this isn't the same amount of winning as before. When there's still pieces on the board, there's counterplay, right? So I also discussed about how if they got rid of the knight and the rooks were also traded, it would just be an easy win because there's no counterplay for black. But here, there is rooks on the board. And we do see that I do get counterplay with my d-pawn. So we're going to see that now. c6, rook a8, d4, rook takes a7, d3 now, b4. And actually b4 is a bad move because now the position's equal. So they should probably just go rook d7, which just stops the pawn in its tracks. If, for example, rook d5, you can easily just take on d5 and this is blockaded. You just bring your king up and you're going to win both pawns, and the b pawn's just going to promote. But instead they played b4. And now I have a funny alignment tactic, kind of like earlier. And alignment shows up in your games, everyone's games, top level, bottom level, anywhere. Alignment's very important because that's just how the pieces operate, right? And the alignment tactic here is a pin. So I play rook c1 and then rook to a1. And the whole point is that this bishop is pinned to the rook. And unfortunately, I'm about to promote this pawn. And either they have to bring their rook over to capture it, which is a deflection tactic, removing the defender of the bishop, or they capture it with their bishop, in which their rook would fall. So here they played rook a8. I played d2. They played rook d8, and I took on a4. And at the end of things, somehow, I'm actually up a pawn. So this is a bit dangerous now, because now, instead of black being down 3 minor pieces like earlier, black's up a pawn and a rook ending. And this is kind of the interesting part about lower level games, is you're going to see a lot of games where you're just down a piece and then you just win your piece back, or anything along those lines. So that was, to me, that was very interesting to look back on when I looked at this game. So my opponent played rook to c5. I played f5. We see king f3, king f6, and king f4. Nowadays, I kind of like the idea of g5. I don't know if this is necessarily the best move, just because it makes the f5 pawn weaker. For example, king f3. If we ever try to go over to d6, now f5's weak. So it feels like, feels not correct almost. But I played h5, which I also don't think is correct. I like king e6 now. And the whole point is you just want to play king d6, right? The only weakness in the position is h7. And they have to play 3 moves to capture the pawn. However, as we see, after h5, now they only need to play 2 moves to capture the g6 pawn, and then both of these pawns are weak. And yeah, so that's why I kind of don't think it was correct. I think just going for the c6 pawn to push it further would have been a better choice here. But they played rook a5. I played king to e6. I think something like rook b5 is interesting. Same thing with like rook b4 actually. Rook b4 pushes the king back, and then you can play like rook b5. Even king e6 now, actually I like. And the reason why I like king e6 is because if something like rook to a6 were happening, then you can just kind of move over, and g6 is not really anywhere close to being captured yet. But again, if the pawn were on h7, I think it still would have been a better choice. Here, it kind of works out, but that's not important. King e6, rook to e5 check, king to d6 now, and the pawn starts pushing, and white's in trouble. It's hard to stop this pawn. And it's also important to note that where does the pawn belong, or the rook belong? It belongs behind passed pawns. So something like rook c6 would be good here. I think the problem with rook c6 is actually rook takes g6 though, which forces a drawn king and pawn ending, surprisingly. After takes, and king takes f5, the king is in the square of the pawn, and these pawns give enough counterplay just in time. But instead, here, as we can see, king d5 would be better, and the whole point is it defends g6, and then you still have the idea of rook c6 and just pushing. I played rook b4, which I don't think is accurate. They played king g5, but I think king e3, and for example, if I play something like rook g4, this doesn't work because of f3, which is kind of cool. And I would love to play rook g5, but unfortunately king f4 just wins, right? So I'd have to move away, and then they can take on g6 with check. So a little fun rook ending for you. But rook b4, king g5, and then I play c4, starting to push the pawn. They took on g6, king d5. They took on f5 now, and c3, and this pawn's actually getting really far advanced, and I think taking on f5 might have been the last decisive mistake. according to the engine, there's a lot of other moves that work. Rook f6, rook a6, rook g7, and rook g8. And I think the whole point is you want to get the rook behind the pawn. Most of these moves do accomplish that, or accomplish to give checks to the black king. Because this pawn is very dangerous, and if you can prevent it for long enough, white does have a majority on the other side of the board. So, sorry, I'm just holding a lighter. I don't know why. Not important. No, I don't smoke. It's for candles. There's candles right there, if you're curious, right there. Yeah. They smell really good. What am I doing? I'm getting so distracted. Okay, so king takes f5, c3, and now the pawn's just kind of pushing. They played rook g5, and I could just play c2, and I don't know why I didn't. I played rook c4 instead, which I mean is kind of the right idea though, right? You get behind the pawn, it's a little slow. They played g4, and I could just take this with the h-pawn, and I did actually. And the whole good thing about that is rook takes g4, I can just take it and go promote my pawn. For example, rook takes, king takes, push. They're way too slow, right? And now with the queen, I'll easily stop these two pawns, and this is easily winning. Instead they played king f6. I played king d4, which doesn't really make much sense. Instead, I should just bring my king back, because now this pawn cannot be captured still. And any extra material you can get in these types of endings is the better. It just prevents these two pawns from pushing, as we'll see in the game. So king d4, they took, and after rook to g1, I actually promoted the pawn in time. And here, it's actually a draw, funnily enough. So if we go back, even around here, the issue is king d4 is just not a good move at all. And that's because after push, and for example, h4, these pawns are just too quick. Let's say f4. h4 apparently also works. I'm checking the engine here. So after takes, for example, they can play f4, and this pawn. The issue is, okay. So for example, let's say we promote, they take, we take, f5, king d2, f6, king e3, and as we can see, there are positions sometimes where the pawn's on f5 where it's fine, but it's not on f5, it's on f6, and there's not really a productive check we can give. And this is like reminiscent of this one study, which I might show in another video sometime, where you actually like have a rook on d2 in a position like this, or like the kings are further back up, and then you play like rook d4 to d2 to e1, and there's like this weird zugzwang. That's a famous study. But as we can see here, yeah, this was just not good, because this pawn's just fast enough to being promoted. For example, f7 should work here, and if rook h6, we can promote. So we have to play rook h8 or rook f4. There's actually a ton of moves, or just checks of some sort. So let's say rook h8, king e6, king e4, king e7, rook h7, king e8. And we're not even in time to get like this knight ending, where like, for example, let's just say if they shuffle for a sec, here, it's still a draw, which is funny because they can actually promote to a knight. Anyways, yeah, so of course they didn't do that. They didn't play f4, which I do think was the right move, because this pawn will be promoted. Again, f4 also kind of is the same purpose of like, if we promote takes, this pawn is just really quick, and the best we can really do here is just get a draw. So instead, king d5 actually blows it, but I think they should have played on. I did promote, which was the right move, and they did resign in this position because now it's a rook versus two pawns, and I think they just like didn't think they had counterplay. Honestly, I think it would be easy for someone at my level to mess this up still. For example, rook takes, I don't know, some f4. Unfortunately, it's just a little too quick. f5, king f4, and we just keep bringing our king in, and this should be enough to hold. We're after something like king e6. We can always just give a check, right? And now this is just completely winning, right? King f7, and we have like rook f1, h4, and we could probably just take that, right? No, we cannot take that. See? That's the trick. Sometimes there's tricks in these positions, but king f5 and king h6 both hold. And I think there's actually just a better move here. Yeah, there's rook c6. Rook c6 just picks up the pawn, which is much easier. But see what I mean? Like, it's so easy to fall for tricks in these positions. And that's why I think they should have played on. But they didn't after c1 equals queen, and I ended up winning my first ever tournament game, which did feel pretty nice. But some of the people that played their first tournament aren't as lucky. Do remember that when you're like playing, especially if you start playing in tournaments, some of your opponents might be unrated and you might be new to the game too. But your opponents might have been playing online for like months and months and months, or even like years sometimes. I think my opponent was also like new to the game, but they just had an established rating, of a few tournaments already. But that is game 1. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in game 2 of this tournament. I only played in 2 of the games out of the 5, and the next game is kind of why. So I'll see you then. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.